Well, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Let me begin by thanking Sharita for that warm introduction and for her friendship over the years. Marion for hosting us, our funders, and all of you for being here this evening. Of course, Chief Contee for being in conversation. So the way I envision this conversation, or the way I've been given instructions to envision this conversation, is really as a conversation about who you are, how your experiences in the city, both as a citizen and as a young officer, shape your approach to policing, and then, of course, some of the ways that you plan, a discussion about where you plan on taking the department in the years ahead, and at the moment in the years ahead. And so I'll just begin with a good part of your bio.
Okay.
And that is that you grew up in Carver Terrace, as I understand it, right off of Benning Road. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us what it was like growing up in Carver Terrace in the late 70s and the 80s, and what your impression was of the MPD during that time?
That's a good question. And thank you, Derek. Thank you, everyone who's hosting and funding this event. It is certainly an honor, privilege, and pleasure to be here with everyone today. I'm a DC kid through and through. When you ask about Carver Terrace and what that was like, it was rough. Anybody who knows anything about anything with terrace on the end of it, that is kind of an indicator. I mean, certainly in my community, homicides were not uncommon. Police being in the community was not uncommon. In addition to the police being in the community, drugs were not uncommon in our community. Poverty and everything that goes along with it was not uncommon to see in the neighborhood where I grew up. It's one thing when you're growing up poor. It's another thing when you're growing up poor, but you don't necessarily know that you're poor. And that was my story, just growing up in this city, a lot of challenges in my own household. I was very out front about that, because sometimes people sensationalize things and try to make things an issue that I don't necessarily think it's an issue. I mean, you don't pick your family, right? I mean, you can choose your friends, but not your family. My father, and thank God he's drug-free now, but, in the household, yes, he was there, but he's been addicted to drugs ever since he was 17 years of age, up until about 11 years ago. So even through my rise on the police department, my father struggling with drug addiction and that kind of thing. And he wasn't the only one in the family, but the only one in the household. Coupled with that, struggling with the drug addiction and having cerebral palsy, right? You put those two things together, right? My mom also has cerebral palsy. So, it's just not the ideal circumstance, but rough, but it made me who I am today. I have a perspective on life. I have a perspective on achieving goals and not being defined by the circumstance that you find yourself in or that you're born into, and just really being able to set goals and really try to be an example for a lot of young people who are in our city who think that there's a ceiling to how far they can go in life.
Now, all of this is happening. You are, you're sort of moving through the neighborhood, going
Yep.
to middle school, Brown, high school at Spingarn.
Yep.
It's 1989,
Yep.
and you join the cadets.
Mm-hmm.
Why? And I ask that specifically because 1989 is a crazy time to join the MPD.
Yep.
The year before, we became the murder capital of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
There's open air drug markets in almost every part of the city,
Mm-hmm.
except the far, far west.
Mm-hmm.
The rate on solving murders is pretty low
Mm-hmm.
because the department, to a certain degree, is in crisis.
Yep.
Did you know what you were getting into, and if you did, why did you get into it?
So no, I didn't know what I was getting into, to be honest. I really didn't. And sometimes when people have asked me that question before, and when I tell them kind of how I ended up joining the police department, they're like, wait a minute, like, are you serious? Like, yeah. So here's really what happened. So it actually started when I was in the 11th grade, my interest. I learned in the 11th grade that in order to become a police cadet, you had to have enough credits in high school to go to the to attend school half day and to attend the police academy the other half of the day. And the way I found this out in 11th grade, I was actually cutting class, and I was up in the balcony of Spingarn High School in the auditorium, and down below, on stage, they were doing basically a recruitment for the police and the fire cadet program. So I'm sitting up there, listening to them talk about, hey, look, you can go to school half day, we'll pay you, and after that, you kind of can go full time and all this stuff. I was like, man, this might be a path. And I wasn't. It wasn't these terms. But now the translation is, this is a pathway out of poverty. It's like, man, I can do this, and these guys will pay me to do this. And that means that maybe my address would change, because at the time, again, still dealing with all of the things that are happening in the neighborhood. So I was a good student, did what I needed to do in school. And when that 12th grade year came around, man, I'm the first guy to sign up. That brought with it some challenges, right? Because to your point, it is the neighborhood, and you're in a police uniform, going to school and coming home, to your apartment in the 2100 block of I Street Northeast. And that was, that presented some challenges, not like, I got bullied or picked on or anything like that, but people kind of look at you different, like, okay, now your father is on crack and you're wearing a police uniform and you both go to the same apartment. Like, something about that, doesn't look right. You know what I mean? But through all of that, that's my story, man. That's how I ended up on the police department. I had teachers, my public speaking teacher, Ms. Bellamy, and we still are in contact till this day. But she really had aspirations for me to immediately after high school to go to college. That's what she wanted me to do. You have so much, blah, 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 you need to go to college. And I was like, Ms. Bellamy, I need to get some money. I need to get a job. That was my mentality. Later on, I went to college. But at the time, it was really a pathway out of poverty. What will allow me to get, to the next stage in life? My parents were not talking to me about, hey, you need to continue your education and, find a good school to go to. I thank God for George Washington University now, right? But then it was not, George Washington University was not in my future.
So you head into the department, 89. The city was a mess in the late 1980s. And correct me if I'm wrong, because this is an outsider's view, but I get the sense that the department, in its efforts to respond to the mess that the city was in, started to develop some problems of its own in the 90s. And I'm thinking specifically of the very large recruitment classes of 89 and 90 that didn't necessarily receive the training that they needed.
Absolutely.
Particularly as the Glocks are being rolled out as issue for patrol officers. But also there's just a problem with a lot of people coming into the department who had relationships with drug dealers. They kept them after they came into the department. And then you can go on to talk about just MPD officers using their guns a lot on citizens in the mid-1990s. As someone who studies institutions and how people respond to institutions, I'm fascinated to know what lessons you learned coming up through the ranks in a department that was in crisis, or at least that appears to someone from the outside was in crisis. And so can you talk about what state it was in and then the lessons that you took away from it? Yeah,
we were in pretty bad shape then. And I almost actually left the police department in 1994. I was going to leave MPD because I was embarrassed to wear the uniform, embarrassed to wear the patch, embarrassed to take my uniforms to the dry cleaners and pick them up from the dry cleaners and walk around with shirts that had this patch on it. In 1994, I was like, our pay had been cut, I think that year, by like 4.2%. The city was in crisis. Our police cars, lack of equipment. You had officers going into their pockets to buy tires for police cars. And it was just a mess then. And, when you're in that space, one of the lessons learned, certainly for me in the seat that I'm in now and looking back on all these experiences, is that you can't cut corners in this business. You absolutely cannot cut corners when you're talking about standards, when you talk about how our police officers engage with community members and the training that's required to get them to be the police officers that we want them to be in community, you cannot cut corners. That was certainly a lesson well learned. And when I think back to those times, it's the reason why I get very nervous when I start to hear terms like defund the police, right? I know what defund the police look like. And I know some people say that and it means different things to different people. But for me, having come up through the agency at a time when there was a lack of funding, one of the first things that go is training, right? One of the first things that go is, okay, well, we can't invest in our people, our most important commodity. We can't invest in them to make sure that we have the police officers that we need to have on the street, or we're trying to think of ways to cut corners. And it just doesn't work. That formula has proven itself time and time again to be a failure. And so as I came up through the department at that particular point when we're in crisis, but for Charles Ramsey, who came into the Metropolitan Police Department with an outsider's view of the agency. I think Mayor Tony Williams was the mayor at the time. Bringing him here was the best thing that could have happened for Washington, D.C. at that time, because our department, our city, was just really a train wreck. And it was showing up in the numbers with respect to the number of use of force incidents where we actually shot people. Some of those incidents were justified, but a lot of them were as a result of poor training, right? Officers, if you look at, what's on an officer's gun belt, he has his firearm, he has handcuffs, officers just resorting to the use of the firearm because from their training, it's like, I'm in survival mode. So I learned so much in that time growing up in the agency when we were not at our best. To see us grow through that. And then now being in the seat where I have an opportunity to really interact with law enforcement executives all across the world, literally. I mean, and countries all across this world, police agencies all across the United States of America. I'm in contact with these guys all the time, just talking about the things that they're doing, some of the things that we should be thinking about here that may be showing up in other parts of the country. So it was a lesson, and certainly a lesson that really helped shape this city to where we are right now.
So I've kind of focused on the really rough years,
yeah,
right? Particularly for MPD. I want to pivot to the 21st century, where the city's changing quite rapidly, and MPD is starting to see really good numbers when it comes to violent crime. It's almost falling off a cliff in some years. Can you talk about how policing has changed in the last 2 decades in the city? And that's from any angle, right? So sort of from bad things happening on the street to a different set of attention or different budgets coming out of the council.
So one of the things, or in terms of how policing has changed, I think we started to see a lot of change here in the city when we became more of partners with community, as opposed to the police department is over here, here's the line, and everybody else is over here. Chief Ramsey, he brought in, partnership for problem solving, where we would get with community members regularly, have meetings within community to talk about problems that are important to community members. If, I'm worried about problem A, through my police lens, I think this is the most important thing. But community members are really saying, no, it's this B thing over here that's really important, really the thing that the police department needs to focus on. Then as a law enforcement agency responsible for public safety, we should really be focused in on where our partners are saying, the people who traverse these neighborhoods day in and day out, who children have to go out there and play, in the street or in a community where there are issues going on that are important to members of that community. Some members of the community say, hey, it's not that, it's the speeding cars up and down this street that's a problem that we need you guys to focus on. We know that these older guys are over here drinking, but that's not really the issue. It's this thing over here that we really need you guys to focus on. So Chief Ramsey brought that to the table for us, and we were not in a posture as an agency where that was something that we normally did. And he was probably one of the most, if I could use this term, he was just a straight talker, right? I mean, he would just tell them what it is, tell them like it is. This is bad, or we messed up if it's something that we did. And I learned so much from him. And I think over the years, we started to see, we started to see more of that happening, and he was open to different things. He brought in the federal, before the federal government could say, hey, we're going to put the Metropolitan Police Department under consent decree. He said, well, hey, look, come on in and look at our stuff and tell us what's wrong, right? We'll work with you to fix the things that are wrong, because we can become the model agency for the country in this space. And he did that. He invited them in. They looked at our stuff. They said, hey, this, and this is wrong. And we said, okay, yes, those things are wrong. We're going to fix them. We're going to work with you to fix them. And those things that we fixed became national best practices in the space of how you investigate use of force, as an example. So we go from the bottom of the list really to one of the agencies at the top of the list in terms of how you do that best. In many other spaces, right, how we handle First Amendment in our city. We grew a lot under Chief Ramsey in that space, and the chiefs that followed after that, but really it started with him. If you look at all of the First Amendment stuff that happens in our city every single day, we were talking a little bit earlier about, there's stuff going on all weekend, right? We got a big festival going on. You got the Poor People's Campaign on. You got a Nationals doubleheader. You got all of this stuff that's happening. And the Metropolitan Police Department is in the center of all of this, right? And of course, an audible might get called. The president wants to move from location A to location B, and we're part of that, So the level of professionalism, the level of inclusion when it comes to community members, and the level of just being open to having outside entities kind of look at what we do to improve upon that, I think are really all things that helped us to become the agency that we are now. Far from perfect, but when we look at where we've come from to where we are now, I think we continue to make strides, and we're doing a really good job of making those strides as a police department.
So I want to pivot to today, and there's so much to talk about.
Yeah.
Everything from January 6th, Black Lives Matter Summer.
Yeah, 4 days on the job for January 6th. Yeah, how about that for a welcome, right?
God help you. So what I want to do to set that up,
okay,
is ask about the peculiarities of being the chief of police in the nation's capital. And you sort of gave us a little bit of that, talking about the First Amendment activities that are happening this weekend. But can you talk about how the system, the larger system of which MPD is a part, is different here? And what's good and what's bad about that from your standpoint as a chief?
Yeah, so, DC is unlike any other place, right? I mean, we are the sheriffs, we are the state police, we are the municipal police. We are all of that for our city. And we learned from January the 6th that even when our federal partners are facing difficult times, we are the help to the federal government, right? I mean, we do all of those things. And most police departments across the country are not set up the way that we are. We have the only city in the United States of America where the U.S. attorney is responsible for prosecuting our local cases here in the District of Columbia. That's, you don't get that when you go to New York, for example, or when you go to other places, Philadelphia, other major cities. The system is not set up that way. We have probably more concentration of different police departments in our city than we do anywhere else. And that can be a good and bad thing. People say, they got more police per capita, blah, 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 right? Yeah, but these guys are responsible for their little piece of the pie, right? The Mint police don't leave the Mint, right? And the guys who are responsible for, you pick the police department, the Smithsonian, they stay right there at the Smithsonian. They don't go past anything else, right? So when you pick up the phone, if there's an issue going on in here right now, and you pick up the phone and you call 911, you're going to get the Metropolitan Police Department. When there's a problem downtown, when we have truckers who want to come to our city and block up our city on the federal footprint, you get the Metropolitan Police Department who's responsible for that. And again, that's not the norm in every place else across our country in terms of the things that we deal with. I mean, the First Amendment stuff, those are just, additional things that kind of come with the territory, because you have to balance that. You have to balance public safety. I can't worry just about what's happening with First Amendment, what's happening with the president, what's happening with visiting dignitaries. I have real communities that we got to worry about, right? If you live in a community, 1200 block of I Street Southeast, and there's gunfire going on in your community, you don't care about what's happening down at 3rd and Independence Avenue Southwest. That's not your issue. So being a police department that is flexible enough to respond to all of those things, it takes a lot of coordination regularly with our federal partners. We in our city, I mentioned the president earlier, kind of moving from point A to point B. If you kind of just had a glimpse at all of the coordination that happens just because a guy wants to get a cheeseburger, there's a lot of coordination that happens in that space in order to make that happen. And the Metropolitan Police Department is at the dead center of that. In that space, there are no do-overs, right? And then as we look at our city in this new posture in the 21st century, people are trying to determine in what space do we really want to see law enforcement, right? So it's kind of this weird space right now, right? Where do we want to see law enforcement? And that depends, right? That depends on who you happen to be having that conversation with. At least that's been my experience. I have said this publicly before, and I'll say it here and really explain what I mean by that. So I believe that people respond differently depending on their proximity to the pain, right? Example. So right now, we don't really, it is unpopular, right? If you talk about police officers, anywhere dealing in the space of dealing with people who have mental health issues, we are afraid the police officers might shoot a mental health consumer or something, so we want to take the police out of that business. And I'm like, great, right? Who's going to do that job, right? When the naked guy is beating on cars and it's in front of your door where you live, who are you calling, right? Who's responding to that? That's going to get there to resolve that issue. And while I would like for these other entities, these other people to respond to that, depending on where people are, people feel differently about that. In the issue of homelessness, being homeless is not a crime. But for some people, when that tent shows up across the street from your house, and yes, it's on public space, and that public space becomes the public restroom right there by your house, people feel differently about that. It's, it is a public health, it is a, mental health issues and all those kinds of things. But now you got to walk your kids through that. And you just want the problem dealt with. And people want to pull the police kind of back into that. So we're in this weird space kind of right now where people are really, I think, trying to decide as a city, really not just as a city. I mean, this is something that this is really happening on a national level. Like, where do we want to see, what do we want to see our police officers involved in? I was talking to the LAPD chief yesterday, Mike Moore, and we were talking about these homeless encampments. Very interesting perspective. In LA, I think it's last year, they had 329 homicides. 80 of those homicides were related to homeless encampments. 80. We've had 2 so far this year. But let's talk about how we got to this space. So at the height of COVID, when we had a lot of our prisons or our jail, et cetera, trying to reduce the population of people that were there for minor crimes and that kind of thing, basically releasing people back out into community, but some of those folks don't necessarily have the supports in place to support them. So where do they end up? On the streets. And when they end up on the streets, what they saw in LA, which could potentially happen here, these homeless encampments became an extension of some of the prison pods that you would normally see in prison. Like, hey, people were showing up in these homeless encampments. And the guy who's running the homeless encampment is now charging tax for people to live in that homeless encampment. And if you don't pay your tax for living in a homeless encampment, then your tent might get burnt up in a homeless encampment, right? So things like that are happening in other places across our country can very easily show up here in the District of Columbia. So again, I go back and say, when you talk about how we respond to things, being in this weird space, people don't want homeless individuals or anybody for that matter firing off a gun across the street from their house. And I have seen that people just respond differently on different issues, and now trying to figure out, like, do we want the police or not want the police? I will say this, and I'll finish. So for your next question, I think that we have to, as a city, it has to be this and that, not a this or that situation. We have to look through the lens of, there are going to be situations that are going to require both a law enforcement and a non-traditional response or something other than law enforcement response to an issue. Because when you talk to mental health workers, the mental health worker doesn't want to deal with a 300-pound naked guy who's banging on cars and windows. They don't want to be hurt. They want a police officer to help support them to do their jobs better. So we got to think more about this and that, not this or that.
So you brought up so much in that question. I want to ask you.
You asked a lot, man.
No, I mean, this is wonderful. So what I'm going to do is take summer 2020 into winter 2021 in chronological order. Right?
All right.
And so we'll start off with the BLM protests, and we'll end with the craziest first week in police department history.
Oh
right?
My God, man.
So summer 2020, you have folks who go down to Black Lives Matter Plaza and of course take the district flag and write equals defund the police. Black Lives Matter equals defund the police. And you mentioned earlier that folks have different notions of that.
Absolutely.
That phrase. You also just mentioned in this last answer that defund the police is a great slogan, but application is really quite difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about whether or not you think the type of the definition of defund the police that you sort of referenced, which is switching police budgets to the social services that, for some things that, quite frankly, police don't want to do, but I think that you pointed out social services folks don't want to do by themselves without police support. In other words, is some of this possible? Like, can this slogan be made into a workable program that you as chief would find preferable for your officers? Or do you think that trying to boil it down into something that would work is just very difficult right now, particularly in this political moment?
I think it's something difficult to do, and I just defund anything in this space. I just don't think I don't think it's good. I think it's cutting corners. We're seeing right now, some of the we're seeing the fruits of kind of some of the things that we did a year, 2 years ago. Right now, police force is at 3,504 officers. That is a significant, now to the average person, that might not mean anything. But if I said that, hey, look, when I started January of 2021, we had almost 3,800, and to be down to 3,504, that is a significant drop in terms of the number of officers that we have to deal with the things that we have to deal with here in the city. So when we talk about defund, I don't see anything good that comes from that personally. I'm of the mindset that it has to be this and that. Why can't we have great public safety and also do the things that we need to do to support people in communities? Why? I mean, like, I would want to live in that community. Absolutely. Where both things happen. Not, well, in order for us to do this, we can't do this. When I think about the police department's budget of the overall city budget, right? If the overall city budget was $1, the police department is about 3 cents of that $1. So, like, is that an area where we really want to be tinkering with when you talk about public safety, when you talk about the livability of our city, when you talk about our city being the attractive city that we want it to be, have people wanting to come to Washington, D.C., feeling safe in Washington, D.C., that's not an area where you should be cutting corners. I don't think anybody should be cutting corners. I think we need to make the investments that we need to make because it goes a long way across the board. I've never met a business owner say, hey, I want to open a store in a neighborhood where there's shooting and there's, this going on and we got this issue happening over here. That's not that's not been the conversation with most people. I've never really had a conversation with people who say, yeah, Chief, well, those police officers you got in my block, I know we got these issues, but yeah, you go ahead and send them someplace else. We don't need them over here. That hasn't been the story. That has not been my experience. And I move all about this city. So the narrative that plays out versus what I hear from residents is different. I think people want the best policing that they can get. I think that they want to see our police officers engaged in spaces where they should be and not criminalizing things that shouldn't be criminalized. I think about my father as an example. My father was sick. He was drug addicted. Locking him up would not resolve, his drug addiction issues. Thank God he never went to prison. I can't believe that, but he did. He never was arrested for any, and he was using drugs. He sold drugs out of our apartment at one point, earlier on when I was younger. Later on, he was just addicted just to everything at that point. But he didn't go to prison. So I'm saying that to say that I think that you have to, we have to look at these problems, these issues that we see from multiple angles to really make sure that we're focused on the things that we need to focus on. And it's not a cookie cutter approach. It is not. People are different. A young man stopped me on Monday and was telling me he's a returning citizen. He just blessed my heart. He's been gainfully employed now, I think he said 7 years. But he was talking to me about the time when he was trying to make a decision shortly after being released from prison. He was telling me that he didn't have toilet paper. And he was trying to make a decision about whether or not he reached out to the people from the church that he had connected with recently since being released versus returning to a life of crime so that he can supply his basic needs. When you got people who are struggling in spaces like that, like that's real, right? I can identify with, I know what that looks like, right? I mean, that's kids in my neighborhood. That's me making decisions, going out the door every day, like, okay, things are rough. What am I going to do? So how do we really focus in on that space and also make sure simultaneously that we have safe communities by having a well-trained police department? They got all the things that they need so we don't see repeats of 1989, 1990.
I want to stay on this, but I feel like we need to pivot to January 6th now.
Come on.
So it's your third day.
Fourth
day. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, you were a veteran by that point.
Yeah, I was a veteran, man. Fully vetted by then, man.
So now, granted, you had seen as assistant chief, I believe, the summer of 2020, and so there was already that tremendous tension between the city and the executive that entailed.
How did you experience the day? I'll just start with that. Can you just walk us through what you saw happening and how you reacted? And then also, can you talk about the way in which January 6th affected the relationship between MPD and the federal government more broadly? And I know that that's huge, right? Because I'm sure it brought you all in the Capitol Police closer together. I'm sure it brought you all in the White House quite farther apart. And so can you just talk about the larger relationship and the effects of that day on it?
Yeah, January the 6th, it's interesting as these hearings start to play out. Even law enforcement officers, we have to have this exterior. So, you kind of stuff things sometimes, right? I mean, you can't see some of the things that you see and just go home and everything is okay. We stuff things sometimes. So, I was watching and I was sitting in the living room at home, and those videos, with the exception of a few, I'd already seen those before. And it conjured up a lot of emotion. I instantly got angry again because, it was like being back there January the 6th on that day. I will tell you that on that day, it was something clearly different. Early on was noted on that day that the tension, just the vibe, if you will. When we deal with these First Amendment demonstrations, there's a vibe that happens, right? I think about certain things. I think about the Obama inauguration. I think about the women's march that we had immediately after President Trump's first immediately after he was elected, the next day, after inauguration, the next day, they had this huge women's march. I mean, it's a million. I mean, it's a lot of people, but it was just like love in the air, right? I mean, like you just feel it. But January the 6th, that was different. It was different from the onset. I mean, from 6 o'clock in the morning, it was different. I remember just kind of moving around, talking to our officers, about, what's going on, and things started to kind of play out, really rapidly. I'm really kind of cutting a very long story short, but I noted, and they talked about this in the documentary that the guy was doing on the Proud Boys. We had locked Enrique Turrio up like on January the 4th, I believe it was, when he first came to town. We locked him up after he left the airport, and this documentary guy was kind of following the Proud Boys around and all that. But I saw that group of about 300 Proud Boys before President Trump started his speech. I saw them walking east on the mall panels going towards the Capitol. I took a picture of it on my cell phone. It was like 10:58. I took a picture. I'm like, this doesn't look right. Everybody else is down here. These guys are going down here, and they got these like orange caps on, and they're like, this does not look right. So I'm talking to my team, and we're talking with the U.S. Capitol Police, and things are starting to really unfold. And man, next thing, it was just like a rapid succession of things that happened after that. The bomb threat came, the first bomb threat, and they're like, oh, it's a pipe bomb. I'm like a real pipe bomb? Yeah, like a real pipe bomb at the DNC, and then like another real pipe bomb at the RNC. And, now I'm thinking, of course, in my mind, in 4 days on the job, like, are people trying to lure first responders, trying to blow something up, and then that as a decoy to do something else? The attack is happening at the Capitol. I get to the Capitol. I'm walking down the steps. I see a sea of people. I see my officers battling. I'm looking on the marble out on the west front. I see blood all down there. That's from my officers. And I'm like, what in the what is going on? Like, our democracy is under attack, and the vice president-elect, and all of Congress are in this building behind me. And I know people have had a lot, well, we should have known this, we should have known that. I hear that, right? Oh, the intelligence, they said they were going to do this. Well, think about this for a minute. If you thought that somebody was going to blow this building up tonight while Chief Contee is in here speaking, how many of you would have showed up in this building to come see me still speak? Most people probably just said, well, we'll watch it online. So do you really think if all the people who are saying, oh yeah, you should have known, like the vice president, and all these members of Congress, do you really think they would have showed up to work on that particular day if they really, really, really thought what had happened, if they really thought that was really going to happen? I think that people thought about the possibility or the probability, but I really don't think that a lot of people really thought that was going to happen. I think they thought it was a lot of talk, a lot of rhetoric. We hear that stuff all the time. Anyway, that aside, tension very thick. But the thing that came out of that, I said this to the mayor, while we are certainly, it was one of the days that we'll never forget. Is also a day that I'm just so incredibly proud of the men and women of the Metropolitan Police Department and what they did on that day. Normally, it's the federal government that's coming to the aid of local government.
Right.
On that day, the Metropolitan Police Department went to the aid of the federal government on that day. Some people across our country don't realize, that's a separate police department. The U.S. Capitol Police is about the size of some major city police departments. That's real.
And they're 2,000 officers?
Absolutely. And then you have to add in, again, the response from the local police department to not only deal with that, but we still got regular stuff going, people still calling in because of somebody's car blocking their driveway that we have to respond to. Right? So again, a day that I will never forget. I get asked about this a lot. And I was in London not long ago talking about January 6th specifically, and just kind of, through the lens of the Metropolitan Police Department, not a partisan look, not this is Republican, this is Democratic. This is just what happened through the lens of our officers who were beat on that particular day, who fought on that particular day, who protected and defended our democracy on that day. And they all did it just because they felt like that's their responsibility. They had a job to do that day. So, you know, while it is this crazy thing that happened, I'm also incredibly proud of how our city overall, our firefighters, you know, I talk about the police department, but our firefighters who had to get through thousands of people. You know, when these calls are starting to come across the radio, person down, unconscious in the crowd. Well, where do you start looking for that person?
Right.
When we start getting calls for shots fired inside of the U.S. Capitol, and nobody knows where those shots are coming from. Where do you start looking at that point? And so with all of the chaos and stuff that's going on, all of the things that are going on, our officers here in the nation's capital, they perform, man, like I've never seen in my life, and I'm very proud of them for that.
So I'm going to slip in two questions here.
Sure.
And so the first one has to do with the toll that January 6th took on the department. I know that one of the issues in the department's history, or in the department's recent history, is trying to get enough recruits locally.
Yeah.
And then trying to hold on to recruits who come from other places because they can get poached from other departments.
Yep.
Was there significant attrition after January 6th is sort of the first half of the question. I think the other is, you know, how have you tried to think through dealing with the issue of bringing up recruiting and keeping DC natives as officers? And if the two are even connected in your mind.
No, those are great questions, man. So we did lose some people after January 6th. Our attrition it's about on par for what it has been for the last couple of years. A slight uptick. I mean, every year we lose about 300 people. The issue for us is at the point we stopped hiring at a point, which is what got us to where we are right now. Mm-hmm. Those are decisions that were made. Aside from that part, when you talk about, you know, just recruiting people and, you know, specifically people here in Washington, D.C. Right now, we generally get from the DMV area, about 60 to 65% of our recruits come from the DMV area. From D.C. proper, it's about 13% of our recruits that are from D.C. But part of that is because of the requirements when it comes to college, the college requirement that we have. But I don't think that is a requirement that you compromise on. This is how we have pivoted in that space. Our police cadets, though, absolutely 100% all DC residents. They're not counted in that number. When they join the police cadet program like I did, not only do we pay them, we start these young people out at 17, 18 years of age. Once they've graduated from high school, that group, they start out making $36,000 a year. They have health insurance. In addition to that, they earn leave. In addition to that, we pay for their college education to get their associate's degree, so that after they, you know, go there 2 or 3 years in the program, depending on what they need, then they can become full-time police officers, which I think is outstanding. Mm-hmm. I've expanded the police cadet program to include, like when I came through, to include our high school young people who are like me back then, who have enough credits to go to the police academy half day or go to the police academy at the end of the day. We've expanded it a bit, and our pool of police cadets now will grow and be the, really, if you will, kind of the incubator for police officers to come. We have budget approval for about 150 police cadets, and we are hiring them. And as we are hiring them, you got new ones that are turning over to become police officers. They're from every ward in this city, primarily from wards 6 or wards 5, 7, and 8. So we're certainly are doing a lot of recruiting in that space, and we're about 50% women, young women that are signed up for our police cadet program. So that's really that's future state for us. While they're not police officers now, we're making these young people the best police officers that they can possibly be by investing in them now, so that we'll see that return on that investment when they go to the police academy as full police officers after obtaining their associate's degree, and they will do well in communities because they are from these communities. And I think that that is absolutely one of the best things that we can do for them. It's one of the best programs in the country. There are not a lot of police programs that go to this length that we've done. Some of them will, send the kids to college, but they don't pay them. They don't, it's kind of an auxiliary kind of thing. We put them in uniform. We make them part of the police department's family, and we grow them in this space. And I think that that is one of the programs that's going to pay huge dividends for us later on down the line.
And Chief, just to give us all a sense of numbers here. So you mentioned 150. Yeah. Within a year's worth of hires, what is 150? So if you're looking at 150 cadets, how many people are you hiring on top of that, sort of go straight in? So
we just got approval for the 150 this past budget cycle. Mm-hmm. So we're building toward 150. We were probably at about 70, 75 initially when we started. Mm-hmm. But what has been happening as we're bringing cadets in, we're close to about, I believe we'll be probably close to 150 by the time we get to September, because there are a lot of police cadets that are in the pipeline. But what's happening is a lot of the cadets, that 70 or so that were in the program, they're now eligible to be police officers because they have the associate's degree. So they come out of the program and into the regular cadet program. So the number hasn't moved tremendously, but we've probably turned over now in the last 6-7 months, probably about 40, 50 police cadets who became police officers. We did one class, all former police cadets, all DC residents that became police officers and now policing the streets of the nation's capital. I think that's a beautiful thing.
That's wonderful.
I really enjoy that.
Yeah, and I know that means a lot to you.
It does.
Considering.
It absolutely does.
So I'm going to end with this question,
okay.
and I know you might need to take some time with it because it's a big question. But so it is in the paper. There's a quote from you saying when you were appointed that you want to go down in the history books as one of the people who changed the trajectory of law enforcement. Mm-hmm. Just a small thing. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about how you have been changing the trajectory of law enforcement and how you intend to keep changing the trajectory of law enforcement, in your time here as chief? And so what have you done that you think has been really positive in the last year or so? What do you hope to do in the years ahead? So
a couple of things in that space, man. I think I look at that through a couple of different lenses. Mm-hmm. I think that there are things internally within the agency that we have to do as a police agency in order to be that police agency that I'm talking about. And that is being open to, we get, scrutinized, probably more so than anybody. But to be open to those things and where it makes sense, make adjustments to the things that we do. For example, the monitors that we had for our use of force, the Bromwich group came back out and they looked at some of our use of force cases and they said, hey, you guys are kind of missing the mark, right? The quality of your product has gone down, right? You guys were at the top of the list, but hey, you kind of slipping here or whatever. And they gave us a list of recommendations to say, hey, here are the 9 things that MPD needs to do in order to really, put themselves back where they need to be so that the monitors are comfortable, best practice for law enforcement, and that the community can feel good about. I said, absolutely. We'll do all 9 of those things. Well, we took their list, and in this time that I've been in the seat, all those things that they had on that list, we've adopted those things. We've implemented them. The DC auditor came back out, looked at what we've done, and they said, hey, MPD and Chief Contee should be commended for correcting these things. We've came back. We've looked at the policies that they've put in place. We looked at some investigations that they've done since we came out and said that they were not doing such a great job. And the chief has got MPD back on the road to being the agency that we know that they can be. That is important. It is important because we're on the nation's capital, and police departments from all across this country, they look at us. They look at the way we deal with things like use of force. They look at us and how we deal with tying in January the 6th. They look at us as a leader in terms of how we deal with First Amendment. Some police departments fail miserably in this space, but we have to deal with this every single day. Every person in here, when what was going on in Ottawa was happening with those truckers, the pressure was on Chief Contee and the Metropolitan Police Department to make sure that does not happen in the nation's capital. That police chief in Ottawa lost his job. I don't think that many people here in the District of Columbia worried about, once we implemented the plan that we implemented, they didn't see trucks camped out on our national mall or in neighborhoods and all kinds of craziness and chaos going on like we saw happen in Canada. That didn't happen here. And that doesn't happen just by chance. It wasn't because they wasn't trying. It's because of good planning. It's because of good training. It's because of good strategy that happened. And law enforcement agencies from all across the country like, hey, Chief, what was your plan? What did you guys do? How'd you accomplish that? What was your plan B? People want to know about that. That changes the trajectory of where we're going. And again, those are some of the external things. When you think about internal things, again, and becoming the best police department in the country, right? I talked about the cadet program, but other police departments would die to have 23% women in their police force. We got 23% women in our police force here in the nation's capital. That sets the standard. We're going for 30% by 2030. Some police departments are barely breaking 10. We're at 23%. I just hired our first female chief equity officer, the former chief of police of the U.S. Park Police, the first African-American chief of police of the U.S. Park Police as my chief equity officer here in the Metropolitan Police Department. That's how we get better. Also, I brought on board as my number 2, the guy we got a little gun problem here. Well, guess what? My number 2 is the former head of the Washington field office of the ATF. He's here. My number 2 here in this department. And when we had issues with our DC crime lab and those things started happening there, how long did it take for the ATF to get their mobile command center from Texas to Washington, D.C., so that we don't miss a beat in processing firearms here in the District of Columbia to see those cases through? We didn't miss a beat. That's how you become the best police department in the nation, being very strategic, making sure that we're doing those things and making those investments, that we're investing in our people. Our cadet investment, that's an investment. It's an investment right now, but we have not yet seen what that is going to reveal because it's later on down the line. Who would have ever thought that a little boy, a little nappy-headed boy from 21st and I Street would one day grow up to be the chief of the nation's capital police department? But every young person that we hire, that we invest in, that we give an opportunity, that we give them a pathway out of poverty, that we give them an education, they're not out there robbing banks and doing all of that kind of stuff. That's huge. And other people are looking at like, well, how did y'all do that? And why, trying to yeah, can we get that? Can we get that play? How do you do that? Police agencies from all around the country. So there are a lot of other things that happen in the space of being inclusive with communities. Chief Ramsey started that. I held our first youth summit where I invited all young people just to sit down and talk with the chief. We had about 100 of them. And the things that come out of the mouths of babes, man, it just blows my mind sometimes. I asked them, about 100 of them, in the auditorium at Eastern High School. The question was simply this. How many of you, 100 people in the audience, young people, have ever had a negative interaction with police officers? And I think one hand may have went up. It's like, wow. So the follow-up question to that was, well, where does this thing come, like the police are this, and there's this love-hate relationship between the police and the young people and blah, blah, blah. And the young people started speaking. And they said, well, that's what my mother talks about and my aunt talk about and my grandmother talk about. And surely that might be from past experiences, but we have a real opportunity to change how young people see us. And what better way to do that than to hire those young people to raise these young people, to educate these young people, to give them an opportunity so that as they're out there policing their communities that they come from, they're not treating this kid and that kid like crap, or they're not being disrespectful to this senior or that senior. They're invested in that community. Why? Because the police department has invested in them, has given them an opportunity to go back and make their community safer. That's changing the trajectory of where a police department is going. It's being inclusive. It's hearing from these young people about what they want to see and what they don't want to see. You know what they told me? They want to find more opportunities to engage the police officers where we're not just coming into the community to make an arrest. If you listen to the national narrative, like, well, we should keep all the kids over here and keep the police over here. The young people are saying that's totally contrary to what their experience is. Most people who went to schools in DC public schools, I am one of them, who went to schools here, remember their school resource officer. My school resource officer was Officer Burton. He's like 80 some years old now. He called me when I became the chief of police here in Washington, DC. I was floored by that.
Wow.
But it was a relationship there. Right. And now we're in the posture because of a national narrative where we're saying, oh yeah, take all the police out of schools. Well, here's the reality about DC. Maybe it's not your kid's school, but remember, go back to what I said earlier. People respond differently depending on their proximity to the pain. There are neighborhood issues that spill over into schools, and school issues that oftentimes spill over into neighborhoods. In 2004, I stood over a dead young man inside of Ballou High School, which is why we established a law here in the city to have police officers in our schools. Maybe your kid's school doesn't have any issues, and that's fine. But for those kids' schools that have issues, it is a struggle just to learn every day if you're not feeling safe in that environment. So again, making sure that I'm doing the things that I need to do as chief of police. When you talk about changing the trajectory, I'm going to tell people like it is, whether they want to hear it or not. This is the truth about the state of where we are. And when I do that, that has been well received by most communities. They say, you know what, might not like, but the chief is going to tell us straight. And that's my responsibility. That's how you change the trajectory, man. I think we're on the way.
I'll take it. Thank you, Chief. Quite a conversation. Absolutely.
Thank you, Chief Contee. Thank you, Dr. Musgrove. This has been a wonderful conversation and a second kickoff to the Benjamin Drummond Emancipation Day series. So we hope we will see you again. Thank you again to National Capital Bank for your sponsorship.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming out to be with us this evening. No questions?
Sorry.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks again, Chief.
All right, pleasure,
really appreciate
man.
it.
Very nice
Really
to meet
appreciate
you.
it.